So our little clicker isn't working well, so I'm going to give hand motions to Scott. So all of these fun things. I'm going to begin reading this morning from the 87th Psalm, Psalm 87. His foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God. I will make mention of Rahab and Babylon to those who know me. Behold, O Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia, this one was born there. And of Zion it will be said, this one and that one were born in her, and the Most High himself shall establish her. The Lord will record when he registers the people, this one was born there. Both the singers and the players on instruments say, all my springs are in you. Let's pray. Father, as we come before you again this morning and we consider a portion of the history of your church, as we consider Cyril and Methodius and the mission to the Slavic people, we pray that you would bring much glory to your name. And we pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so as we're beginning this morning, we've moved into medieval church history, and last week we talked about the medieval worldview and how that differed from the ancient worldview as well as our modern worldview. And as we've moved into this time period, I want you to remember that the church is drifting apart. There's the Western Church and the Roman Empire. We talked about Constantine and what would become the Holy Roman Empire. And then in the East, there is Byzantium. So these two kingdoms that are developing separately. And today we're going to come right in the middle of these two kingdoms, and we're going to talk about the Slavic people and these two missionaries that are brought to the Slavic people. You can bring the next one too. So the Slavic people are a linguistic group or an ethno-linguistic group that are brought together through Slavic languages, part of the Indo-European language family called Slavic. They're traditionally divided into three main branches of geographical distinction. So we talk about the Eastern Slavs, that's the Russians and the Ukrainians and those in Belarus. And then the Western Slavs are the Poles and the Czechs and those from different break-offs of Slovakia. And then Southern Slavs, the Bulgarians, the Serbs, the Croats, Bosniaks, the Montenegros, etc. So there's these three different groups that have developed over time from this one group that we call the Slavic people. And you can see the map here that was on the screen, and that shows you some. And this whole big blue part, like you see the Black Sea in the corner, and then right above the Black Sea bumping into Ukraine that is red there, that's Russia. So you got Mother Russia to the east, and then all of these little nations that, at least in my lifetime, were still part of this larger conglomerate called the Soviet Union. So the next slide, the Slavs are believed to have originated in Eastern Europe, likely in the region between the Oder and the Dnieper rivers, expanding around the 5th to the 7th centuries. And they migrated in different directions. So some of them went north, some went south, some went west. And you can see that those different Slavic cultures developed as they shot off in different directions. And that also brought different conflicts or political conflicts in their lives. So there would be the westernmost would have conflicts with Germany, and the southernmost would have conflicts with Islam, and the easternmost would come in conflict even with their own people, thinking about Russia and Ukraine and some of those ancient discussions as well. So the Moravians, the Bulgars and Serbs, They're all people from the Slavic race. They came to central Russia, spread through the plains of Eastern and Central Europe, and they worship various gods originally. Perun, the god of thunder, and Dazbag, the god of the sun, and Jarovit, the god of springtime. So that's the people group. That's who we're thinking about. And during this time, remember, you have 4 or 5 centuries of Christianity in the West that's developing, and you have 4 centuries of Christianity in the East that's developing. And as you bring those together and you sort of move north a little bit, you have this whole group of pagan people that have had little contact, although some contact, with Christianity. There's already missionaries there. There's already some small churches. There are clergy working there as well. But we move in our story to the mid-9th century to a man named Prince Rostislav. So that's the next slide, Scott. And that's his name. And then I think there's one more slide after that we can go right to. So the king Rostislav ruled over this location between the Morava River, separated from modern-day Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Austria, a far distance from Constantinople. So Constantinople in the east. And the king wants to remain independent. He doesn't want to be brought into the empire called Byzantium. And he also wants to remain independent from the German kingdom that is to the west. And remember that at this time, the Germans are heavily influenced by Rome. That connection, which we call the Holy Roman Empire, that has grown, and Germany, or what present-day Germany, becomes sort of central to that empire. Rostislav turned to Constantinople rather than to the west, and Christianity is already being practiced in that country, but he asked the emperor to send teachers who would explain the Christian faith in their language, which is the Slavic tongue. So the Moravians are the first Slavs to show interest in Christianity, and in 860, this prince asks the Emperor Michael III to send missionaries to instruct his people in Christianity. So the Christianity to the Slavic people is not organic from the bottom up. It's going to come from the top down, where the king is going to say, our people, my people, need to be instructed in this, and he's going to have reasons for that. But he asks for the East, and this, keep talking about the East and the West, it's important in this story. He asks for the East to send missionaries to come and to preach and to teach in their nation and to bring the gospel. So the next slide is an image of the fighting at the door. And what we see in this time, this is 9th century, when we look at a slide like this, we see that both the sword and the monks are together in those discussions. The difficulty with this time period and with these missions is that both the sword and the keys are working in a way where they come together to convert a nation. It's not the gospel going into a nation alone and then the nation being converted and then the king being converted. It's people coming in with the sword, fighting, coming in with the gospel, preaching, and together those things occur at this time. So some of this backstory is we've met Rostislav. There's also in the west, there's a king named Boris, who is a Khan of the Bulgars. And you can give the next slide too, Scott. And Louis the German, king of the eastern part of Charlemagne's empire. And he grew in his relationship with Western Christianity. So there's the Germanic tribes in the West. Western Christianity is growing there. There's a relationship with this one Slav named Boris, and that relationship is developing, and then there's also this relationship with the East that's developing. So the question becomes, who is going to have the Slavic people? Are they going to submit to Rome, or are they going to submit to Constantinople? And this becomes the big discussion as missions occurs in this part of the world. Now, you might remember at this time that in worship, there are two languages that are competing. So we, in church here, preaching is in English, right? Now, in the 9th century, preaching is going to either be in Latin in the West, or it's going to be in Greek in the East. Now, there's one more language that's appropriate liturgically. Does anyone know the third language that's liturgically appropriate? Okay, so Aramaic would fall under, what's the mother language of Aramaic? You know this. Hebrew, right? So there's Hebrew, and there's Greek, and there's Latin. And the thinking of the church at this time is that these are the three liturgical languages that's appropriate for public worship. And the proof text given for that is that when Jesus was on the cross, these are the three languages that proclaimed who Jesus Christ was. Okay? So come back into Slovakia. You have the Latins on the west, and they're speaking in Latin from Rome, and then from Constantinople coming in from east, they're speaking in Greek, and they're worshiping in Greek. And this relationship with the Slavs, where there's those pressuring from the east and those pressuring from the west, it becomes the big conflict in the people of Slovakia. And there's this relationship that's growing in difficulty, and the king is hoping to align with Constantinople because he thought that's the best way to preserve his kingdom. Okay? So Boris converts to Christianity. Rostislav is going to come later. And the first reason why, this is the next slide, the next bullet point, is that he thought that this would unify his people under one transcendent belief system. He saw the kingdoms on opposite side of him are Christian, and he's looking at his kingdom, and he's seeing all of this paganism that is not unifying his people, and he thought this is really the best way to unify his people, is bringing them under this one religious conviction that the nation would have together. And then the second reason that he converts is that earlier on in his life, his sister is kidnapped, and she's taken to Constantinople as a slave. And as a slave, she is converted to Christianity, and then eventually she's released, and she goes back home, and she's a Christian. And she's able to speak to her brother, who's a king over some of these people, and say, this is what I've learned in Constantinople. This is the gospel. This is what it means to be a Christian. And then the third reason that's given is that he was attracted to the gospel and the Christian beliefs because their evidence of the people around him was that there was seriousness in the people. He saw something of sobriety in the people that he appreciated, and he said, well, if there's this affecting in their lives, then this is probably something true, and that's going to be good for our people. You know, having people that are sober-minded in your kingdom is going to be better than people that are loosely minded. So he converts to Christianity, and he aligns with Constantinople to the east, and this power struggle between the east and the west continues. And we see that these churches, Slavic churches, Bulgarian churches, they become Orthodox, or they become Eastern, as it would be called at this time. But there's a difference. They're not under the control of the emperor. They're going to be independent from the emperor in the sense that he doesn't have authority in their churches in the way that the Eastern churches would would have that authority under, the emperor would have authority in the Eastern churches. And then the prince, he knows of Cyril, who's the person we're talking about, finally getting around to, through connections with that empire, the Byzantine Empire. And he invites him and his brother to come and to preach and to teach his people. So he says, this is what we need. I'm a Christian now. I need missionaries to come in, and I'm going to call this one that I know of from the empire to come in. So that's where we are introduced to Cyril and Methodius. We'll take the next slide too. So who are these brothers? And there's a bullet point that's about to pop up. Cyril, whose name was Constantine at birth, his date's 826 to 869, and Methodius, 815 to 885. They're brothers. They're of Greek origin. They grow up in Thessalonica, where they come into contact with Slavic people. And as they come into contact with Slavic people, Cyril has a gift for linguistics. He's able to pick up languages, and he picks up Slavic even as a young boy. They're from a family that is well connected. The father's name is Leo. He's a high-ranking Byzantine official, and he is an administrative officer within the military. So he has a lot of responsibilities in Thessalonica, and his position suggests that the family is well connected to nobility. And then the next bullet talks about their mother, Maria, who the most recent historians that are studying Cyril and Methodius are saying that Maria is probably Slavic. Now, is she Slavic? I have no idea. But that's the current research saying that most likely she is of Slavic origin. And Thessalonica at that time has a pretty significant Slavic population. So that's something that could be true. And then we see Cyril. Cyril, as he's trained, he goes to Constantinople, and he is going to study linguistics there, and he is going to become a professor, and he teaches languages. He teaches linguistics in Constantinople, and then eventually he's going to become a monk. So we have a linguist, he's well-traveled, he's multicultural in the sense that he's from a Greek place in Turkey and may have Slavic connections at that point. And then his brother, Methodius, he is going to, like his father, go into military administration, and then eventually he's also going to become a monk. So Methodius, somebody that can gather people together and also has skills in his monastery background, and then the brother Cyril being the one who's both the linguist as well as a monk. And then one more point, Cyril also had previous missionary experience. He was a missionary to Arabs in 855 and in 856 on the northeast coast of the Black Sea. So Cyril and Methodius arrive in Moravia in the fall of 863, and they remain there for about 4 years as this mission happens. Now, the principal aim of their mission is to train the native Slavic-speaking clergy. So they're not coming in as groundbreaking missionaries. They're coming in to organize and to gather and to bring people together and lay the foundations for the church by translating the Christian texts. So remember, from the East, you have texts in Greek, you have the Divine Liturgy, you have the New Testament, and you would have other forms of prayer that are used. And then from the West, you're going to have the Roman liturgy, you're going to have a Latin Bible called the Vulgate that we've talked about, and other liturgical forms from the West. So they're brought in, and they're translating from those languages into this Slavic language so that the people are able to understand what they are able to hear. But the key in the what's on the screen is that when they arrived, they copy the sacred liturgy used from the churches in Constantinople, but before they could be folded into the traditions of the Eastern Church, they would have to be translated into Slavic. And I want you to notice that last line. There's no written form. Okay? So you have a language that is oral, but it's not written. Christianity as a language is written, and it's oral. It's both. So this is the work that they have to do. They come into a people group, and this is much like modern missionaries today that go into places where there's language, but there's no written form, and they have to hear the language, and they have to put that from oral into a written form so that the scriptures can be translated into that language. And this is what they do. Now, something else that's important is that there is nothing remaining of the writing of Cyril or Methodius. So there's no sermons, there's no books, there's no lectures, there's nothing of that, of their information left. And we're going to come back to why that's important at the end. But their work is that they literally invent an alphabet, and then they translate the Bible and the liturgy, the divine liturgy, into their language. And this slide here is an example of a Cyrillic language. And the first words that Cyril translated are from the Gospel of John that he wanted the people to understand. In the beginning was the Word. This work of translating for Cyril and Methodius was so important that he reminds the people that there's something reflective in the written word, in language, that is reflective of the character and nature of God. That God speaks and uses words. And when a people are converted, they become a people that read. That written words, become important in Christianity. So let's look at some of their work, their language and translation work. And we'll see that Cyril invented this new alphabet based on the Slavic word for speak. It's glagolitic. He based it on Greek letters. And he and his brother spent the next 3 years translating the liturgy and the gospel into the language of the Moravian people. Now here's where it becomes, or it gets to be interesting politically. So this is the modern symbol of political outrage. So Louis the German, who is also planning to send missionaries to the Slavic people to go and to translate and to preach, he begins to send his own missionaries to translate into Latin, or translate from Latin into Slavic. So you have Cyril and Methodius coming in, and they're doing work to bring the Eastern Church to the Slavic people. And then Louis the German says, well, that's not good. We need those people aligned with Rome. So we're going to send our own missionaries and our own preachers and teachers, and they'll capture the people's hearts for Rome. So this becomes the fight or the trigger among the Slavic people, and there's this back and forth that happens between the East and the West as to whose liturgy is going to be used in public worship. And eventually, there's a decision made. They are going to worship in their own language. That's different for this time. And it's different to the point that this young, go back to the trigger lady, where it's triggering both the East and the West, because it's not the way things are supposed to be done. The so-called College of Patriarchs in the East and the Emperor, they want things done in Greek, and from Rome, they want things done in Latin. And here's this people group that have come into Christianity merely 10 minutes ago, and they're going to tell us the way that things are supposed to be done in public worship. And that is something that is going to cause problems. So we see that Methodius and Cyril, they set out to free Moravia from the Franks, but instead they freed Bulgaria from both Rome and Constantinople. So they become their own sort of version of Christianity. They become a key people group that doesn't seem to be able to fit into the East or the West. Now, there's lots of news junkies and smart people in this congregation. Think of the Slavic people today. Think of Ukrainians and Russians and Serbs and people in Croatia and all of these places. And in your mind, catalog them. Remember, we're medieval now, so we have to have a category for everything. Categorize them. Are they Eastern people or Western people? They don't fit. Even today, this people group still is not fitting neatly into the boxes that we like. They're not well aligned with Rome, and even though today they would be part of the Eastern Church, they don't align well with the Eastern Church as well. And then something happens, like the current Tsar of Russia wants to take over Ukraine, and we all stand and we're like, what is this about? And then, you know, the famous interview, well, in 988, this is the problem. This is still a problem today, and they don't fit into this category. So we see some of these languages that are invented by, or the written language that's invented by Cyril and Methodius. Even today, they're divided into 4 categories that start with, that have a starting point with Cyril as a missionary. So Russian, Ukrainian, Serbian, Macedonian, and then non-Slavic languages like parts of Turkey or Uzbekistan, or some of the other stands, the Mongolic, which would be Mongolian and Iranian, and a variety of Persian languages, and then the Caucasian languages like Czech and Serbian, and some of these other places. So all of these language groups that didn't have a written language go back to Cyril as a missionary as that starting point for their language to be used. And what Cyril did, because he didn't know, like you have to invent all the forms for sounds, and what he does is he just takes the Greek alphabet and he just tweaks it a little bit. So he'll change a word or a letter to have a little bit of a different look. And that's why when you see some of these Eastern languages, they look very Greek. And then the sounds that were unable to be made with Greek script, he uses Hebrew. So sometimes you look at him and you're like, that looks like a Hebrew letter. I wonder what that is from. And it's Cyril. Cyril's the one that first did this. Now, the next slide shows us that there's tensions that occur, and we'll go one more. And these tensions end up where the question of, are the Slavs going to look to the east or the west, and who's going to be their spiritual authority over them? And then as the decision was made that the Slavic people would worship in their own tongue, this leads eventually to the arrest of Methodius. So he's arrested for that decision being made. And then Cyril and Methodius eventually go to Rome, and they there acknowledge the authority of the Pope. So they're Eastern monks that go to Rome, and if you want to win the heart of the Bishop of Rome, and you're from the East, you whisper in his ear and you say, "You are actually the chief patriarch over all the patriarchs." And that won the heart of the Roman bishop, the Pope. So as that happens, as they recognize his authority, the Pope just blesses their work. He's like, "We don't need Latin for the Slavic people. You recognize my authority, so let's just have things done in this Slavic language that you are working on." And then the Pope sends other missionaries to go and to work with them. Now Cyril dies while he's in Rome, and Methodius goes back alone, and he's going to continue the mission by himself in the Slavic tongue. Now, the bishop in Rome, you remember at this time, is in conflict with the bishops in the Germanic tribes, or the German bishops. So the German bishops hear that the bishop of Rome has allowed this to occur, and they're not going to have it. So the Holy Roman Empire has moved north. That's the centerpiece of Christianity in the minds of the Germanic people. And so the bishops in Germany say Methodius needs to be arrested for this work. And he does. He gets arrested, and he is called to a synod in Germany in 870. And he is tried, and he's convicted of heresy. And the heresy, again, is the liturgy and the Gospels and the New Testament being in the language of the people. That's the heresy that he's arrested for. And he is put in prison. I think we have a picture of this Bavarian prison. And then he is released about 3 years later. So he spends about 3 years in prison for the gospel being in the native tongue of the people. And then when he's released, we're told that he becomes the first archbishop of Moravia, and Christianity then spreads into Bohemia. And in this, we see the sharp contrast with that pursued in the West. They developed a new language as a teaching device. The faith is presented not as a foreign element, but rather as something indigenous to their culture, and they spent time explaining their dogma to their hearers. So this is something fresh and new in the Christendom that we've seen developed. The East is very Greek-oriented. The West is very Latin-oriented. And here's this group in the late 800s, early 900s, and then moving into the late 900s that is very much, we're our own people, and we have some connection with the West, and we have some connection with the East, but we're sort of standing here in the middle of both worlds. So what are some lessons that we can learn from Cyril and Methodius? So the first lesson is related to the keys. The conflict between the emperor and the church, where the keys of the kingdom, preaching, discipline, sacraments, when these keys are given over to the emperor, it does not end well. We see that conflict in church culture in this relationship to whether the Pope is in charge or the emperor is in charge in the East. And what that ends up doing is it actually hinders the gospel from going forward to the Slavic people. You know, as Reformed Presbyterians, we have a very high view of the role of the state in its relationship to Jesus Christ. But the state is never given the keys. The keys belong to the church. The gospel discipline, sacraments. That's the job of the church. And when the state and the church are interfering, it ends up hindering the work of the gospel. And we see that with the Slavic people, even where there's been about 1,000 years or 1,100 years of conflict that is religious and political. So a problem that started in the late 800s, early 900s, continues today because the church at that time was not able to say, here are the keys, missionaries, preachers, and teachers, you go forward, and then the politicians deal with things politically separately, both under the authority of Christ. And that caused conflict. The next is related to liturgics. So this time begins, especially as we go east, it begins a time period, probably that continues today, of liturgies at the expense of theology. Now, these liturgies at the expense of theology is because there has been an increase in things that we saw at the end of the ancient church history. Things like the increase of icons used in the church, the increase of a political theology at the expense of thinking and writing. We see that robust Christian thought begins to decrease as liturgics increases at that time. So it is what one historian called a time of growing sterility in theological thought. And we see that in the Slavic Christianity. Later, we're going to meet a very important Slavic thinker before the Reformation, so that's a long time from now. But for the most part, there's not robust theology that's going on in this period and in this place in the world. There's lots of liturgics, and that's what we see in their Christianity. The next slide. This is something that illustrates this growing division between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. In a few weeks, we'll get to the split where there's an official excommunication that is put on the altar at the Hagia Sophia, where the West excommunicates the East, and it's a terrible thing. But we see that growing division is something that is happening even now. Now, part of that growing division you see in the East and the West in their relationship to Easter. So, I have to mention Easter about every 5 classes. So in the relationship between the East and the West for Easter, the West is focused on the crucifixion and the atonement. And the East begins focusing on the resurrection and the ascension. And that division, even in the way that the Easter ceremonies are focused on, shows some of the way that their theology is going to develop separately. Atonement in the East or in the West, and discussions on how the crucifixion of Christ relates to us here and now, versus the East beginning to focus on otherworldly things at the expense of thinking about things like how the atonement relates to us today. So you can ask an Eastern theologian today, someone from the Eastern Orthodox Church, what's the official position on the atonement? And then ask a Roman Catholic, what's the official position on the atonement? And then all of the divisions that come from Rome, which would be Protestantism and those things that come out of a Western tradition. We have views on the atonement that are rock solid in the sense that we will outline it for you. In the East, mystery is going to be elevated. And mystery is going to be elevated because they're looking up at a different world, and that different world begins to form their liturgies. And those divisions are going to be even illustrated here as we've seen today. The next lesson is the value of deep labor. Cyril and Methodius go into a land to preach and to teach, and they have to literally build the tools that they're going to work with. And they're building the tools of what they're going to work with is something that shows the value of hard work and deep labor. I remember do you remember when I said that the three languages that give the pronouncement of who Christ is on the cross? Cyril says, "Are you not ashamed to decree only three languages?" You know, he thinks that's a shame. That all of these languages of the world that God has given, as the book of Revelation tells us that this worship is going to happen in. Cyril says that these people should not remain blind and deaf. He says, "Tell me, do you hold this because you consider God so weak that he cannot grant it, or so envious that he does not wish it?" And the idea was that the gospel should go out into all of these native languages. Now, something interesting today is if you go to Rome and you ask the official position of the Slavic languages, this is a pre-Vatican II, ask the official position on the Slavic languages, and they've elevated it to the point where it's equal with Greek and Hebrew and Latin. And that goes back to this discussion, because they've said, well, we're not going to win this battle, so let's just give it over to them. So the value of deep labor. And then the last is that we should never despise small beginnings. So this work was not huge during their lifetime, but what we see is that after Methodius is appointed as the first archbishop in this area, he lives for about 16 more years, and he continues preaching and teaching. And those that he raised up went into other Slavic nations to preach the gospel, and eventually, even as Prince Vladimir would hear of the gospel and be converted and bring all of the Russian people under Christianity. And that's in 966. Vladimir's baptized, and this whole people group that, from the perspective of Vladimir, he would call the Great Rus people. He would bring them together under Christianity. So modern day Russia, Ukraine, Belarus all become Christians under the work of Cyril and Methodius, even as this work continued for the next 100 years. So any questions or thoughts on that? And sorry for the Amber Alert there at the end. Jessica? Polish is one of them. I don't know. I couldn't tell you where in the family tree it falls, but it is one of the Slavic languages that is Cyrillic.
Yeah, so I was just curious because you said the East and the West came to this agreement to teach the Slavs in their native language. Later, Methodius was imprisoned for that heresy. Do you think when he was, as that was unfolding, did he know that it was a heresy that he would be later jailed for, or was he just doing it because he was?
I don't know if he thought it was a heresy that he would be jailed for. He thought it was important enough for the people to have the gospel in their own language that he, gave the lip service to the Pope in Rome that needed to be done. He kissed the ring to the point where he got the permission to do it. But it was the Western Germanic tribes that were more angry than the Pope at that point because he had been flattered. I don't know if he knew it would be categorized as heresy. Joseph? Oh, great.
You mentioned atonement. Which view of the atonement comes from the East?
So if you read Eastern thinkers on the atonement, there's a lot of variety. You will get some bishops in Eastern Orthodoxy that have a more Western view of the atonement, and you could have other Eastern bishops that say it's a mystery we don't know. So there's just a wide variety of thinking on it, where in the West they're going to solidify what they think. Of course, when Protestantism breaks off, when that second great schism happens, there's a definitive atonement position that we take that's different from Rome's position. But the Western Western theology develops in a much more dogmatic fashion than the East. Any other thoughts? One more.
When you talked about they focused on the liturgy, and so they became more non-theological, is it kind of because they had a book, it just became stagnant?
Yeah, so that they have this, at least the New Testament translated into their language, and then they have the divine liturgy, meaning like we come to church and this is what we do. These are the prayers that are said. This is how we have communion. This is when we stand. This is when we sit, and that becomes just sort of what their theology is. If the divine liturgy is essentially canonized, why do we need to think more about some of the ways to apply that? And that, at least in like a Russian Orthodox or the Slavic Orthodoxy that's developed today, you do have a lot of that, just the focus on this is how we do it, rather than people thinking and expanding and growing in the way the West does.